Hello and welcome back to For St. Pete's Sake. My name is Christian Hotchkiss. I'm the president of the Stonewall Democrats of Pinellas County. I am joined as always by my vice president, Laura Gherkin. We are the official podcast of the Stonewall Democrats of Pinellas, where we deep dive into everything political here in Pinellas County, across the state of Florida and beyond. Laura, how are you today?
I'm doing pretty good, Christian. I am, October 1st is next week officially. So I'm really waiting to get into pumpkin spice season. I'm not gonna lie, a pumpkin spice ice latte doesn't really hit the same as, the hot pumpkin spices back when I lived in Ohio, but it's still good.
It's a white girl's dream. It's a white girl's dream every year.
It is.
Well, I'm pretty excited because today on For St. Pete's Sake, we are sitting down with former Congressman David Jolly, once a Republican representative from Florida's 13th district, now a frequent political commentator and critic of the modern GOP. In 2018, he publicly broke with the party and rebranded as an independent voice. In April of this year, he officially changed his registration to Democrat to run for Florida governor. And here in Florida, especially in progressive cities like St. Pete, many voters are still asking, what does accountability look like for someone who once stood with the party that has been attacking our rights? We're going to deep dive today on LGBTQ rights, abortion access, and the political transformation here in Florida. So let's get into it. Hi, David Jolly.
Hey, good to be with you. I appreciate the opportunity.
Absolutely. We're so thankful that you could come on, and we appreciate your time very much. And we want to give you a couple of minutes here just to introduce yourself, go into anything that you want to talk about.
Yeah, so look, thank you for that introduction. I did have the opportunity of serving Congress from Pinellas County. I was a Republican 8 to 10 years ago. I spent maybe 6 years in the independent space, organizing what honestly is the fastest growing part of our body politics and trying to figure out, the independent space is very much a democracy reform space. You take on gerrymandering, open primaries, money in politics, all those things that try to empower more voices in democracy. And along the way, when I was on TV, I would often say, look, I consider myself part of the Democratic coalition because I think the independent space in the last 10 years, honestly, since Trump, has been allied with the Democratic Party. But I was never a Democrat until recently, earlier this year. And to be honest, I am open about my journey, right? Mine is a journey of change. I have changed. And where I always say this very respectfully about one of my predecessors, Charlie Crist, he spent 10 years trying to convince us he hadn't changed. I tell people about my change. I think change is important in politics. As I served and started applying some of my ideology to public policy making, I wasn't sure about the outcome. And so I did start to change. And sometimes I think the problem in politics aren't people who change, it's the people who won't. But I get they're very fair questions, right? Jolly used to be a Republican. He used to take certain votes here. 10 years later, he's talking about issues in a different way. So that's part of my journey. Look, I always focus, frankly, on three fundamental values, political values, but I think values that should be part of our society. And in retrospect, it's those values that haven't changed. My policies have, but the values that I had as a Republican fighting within my own party, and then the values I had as an independent, and then the values that allowed me to find a home in today's Democratic Party, those values have been consistent. The three basic values I always talk about. The economy should work for everybody. Everybody. The economy should work for everybody. Now, I think importantly, that doesn't mean we should condemn success, right? Congratulate success. But let's be people who fight for a fair economy, for fair capitalism, meaning for the lowest wage earners, for the families trying to put food on the table, healthcare for their kids, for the person who loses their job. The economy should work for everybody, and it's not right now. It's not working for everybody. Secondly, the government actually has a role in our lives, right? In an era of DOGE where government is under attack, it actually has not just a role, but a responsibility. We pay for it. It's our taxpayer dollars. So what should the government do for our seniors, our veterans, our storm victims, families in need of excellence in public education, safe communities, investments and opportunities for youth? And honestly, I think we'll get into this, I'm sure, but we don't have equality of opportunity right now. My Republican allies like to suggest we do. But to me, the government has a role in ensuring that we actually do have equality of opportunity, because a kid born 10 miles south of my children, their life looks very different than my kids, and it's based on nothing more than socioeconomic and demographic realities that we should accept as a state. So the economy should work for everyone. We should accept the reality of, I should say. We shouldn't accept those differences. We should accept the reality. So the economy should work for everyone. The government has a role. And the third value is simple and basic, and it's heartbreaking that it's controversial right now, but um, we should be a home. And I see a Democratic Party where everyone is welcomed and empowered, regardless of the color of your skin, where you were born, who you love, or who you worship. So those are our values. Look, as a Republican in Congress who supported marriage equality, climate science, gun control, campaign finance reform, I was trying to exercise those values. As I was growing towards reproductive freedom, I wasn't always there. That was me figuring out those values on an important constitutional question. And so look, that's a broad introduction. But if you ask who I am as a gubernatorial candidate, who I was as a Republican member of Congress, those values have always defined what I have tried to exercise in politics. And I think it's why I finally found a home in today's Democratic Party.
That's really great. And I'll tell you, I was camping over the weekend in Ohio. So coming home on Sunday and Monday, I had a nice 17-hour drive. And I'm not gonna lie, I thought about our conversation a lot and how I wanted to approach it because I think that I think it's really impressive being able to grow and change. And the more looking that I've done into your record, which, I looked at like 2014 to present. That's, a good 10 years. That's a good amount of time. And you did vote to expand early access to early voting locations and expanding vote by mail and advocated for more polling places. Those are all very important things to our democracy. And again, like you said, you've grown on your position on reproductive justice, um but at least I guess what they can say is like they were more quote unquote what we called at the time were like common sense sort of restrictions of like a 20 beak ban, which like I understand. Personally, don't agree with, but again, I understand. I'm pragmatic about it. And like you said, on LGBTQ issues, you did support the marriage equality and workplace protections for LGBTQ people. And so
Thank
I
you for
think
doing that research, by the way. Thank you for those reminders, because in
yeah.
Democratic primary politics, all I hear is about the bad votes I took. So
No, but I mean, that's what I'm saying. Like it's I'm sure you've been getting that a lot everywhere. And this is I think a time, and this is where I think you benefited from my 17-hour drive, is that like I don't want to necessarily call out and say explain this, why this, blah 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 this, because I'm not sure. I want to know more about your journey, because it seems that you really were started more, yes, you had that Republican title because, we are a two-party system in this country, but it does sound like you always started on more of a moderate position.
yeah, yeah. Look, I always described myself as a Bush 41 Republican, right? So I'm 52 years old. I came of age. Sure, I was a kid during Reagan, but the first campaign I worked on was Bush 41. And whatever we think of Bush 41 and the politics of 1988 and 1992. He was the president who rejected the NRA, right? When the NRA went too far, he turned in his card. He actually saw a role for government, strong national defense, less government, less regulation, but he actually got in trouble, lost the presidency, lost his party support because he signed a bill that actually did increase revenue. And that was, they had started to apply litmus tests within the party that you couldn't do that. So look, I was a Bush 41 Republican. But despite the grace you're willing to give me, I will say that even in 2012, 2013, when I started serving, I took a lot of very conservative positions. I started off taking very conservative positions in some areas, and and they did not reflect where my values were. Part of my journey was look, the first time I ever served in any elected office was the United States Congress. I wasn't on city council, I wasn't in state legislature. And so, yes, I went in still, my tether was to the more moderate wing of the party, which really didn't exist. There were about 10 of us left. But the way politics works in a legislative body, I took some very conservative votes. let's stay on reproductive freedom for a while, because my my critics will say Jolly took a lot of super anti-choice, pro-life positions. Yes, I did. I did. And the reason why, what I learned as I started to serve, not when I decided to run for governor this year, but if you start to watch my trend in Congress, I was wrongly applying my faith teachings to a constitutional question. I'm a preacher's kid. Today, I'm still a member of a Christian church. My wife and I practice our Christian faith. I don't hide from my faith. I talk about it because it's part of who I am, but I also say it is not to evangelize. And very importantly, after 8 years of culture wars in Florida, the job as the next governor is to leave my faith at the steps to the state house, not to bring it into the state house. We shouldn't shy away. And as Democrats, we should welcome people of faith. When I saw Kamala Harris do that last summer, I thought, wow, I can actually see myself in this party now. Like, there's a place for me in this party. We should welcome people of faith who believe in the constitutional protections that keep faith out of politics, right? That's kind of the contrast we draw maybe with the other side. But I made mistakes applying my faith to the constitutional question of reproductive freedom. And as I realized those mistakes, for those who cared to follow a backbencher member of Congress, I became the only Republican to vote against the Planned Parenthood investigation. That was a hard vote for a Republican, right? When Republicans
Absolutely.
decided to remove $400 million from Planned Parenthood, I realized that that rescission would reduce access to reproductive care. And so my compromise was to move it to community health centers. As I learned, it wasn't apples to apples, right? But it was part of my journey to try to fight for a continuation of reproductive health care funded with federal dollars. Republicans didn't want me. Democrats didn't need me. I became a testament to the axiom in politics. You stand in the middle of the road, you get run over. But it was part of my journey. But the most important part of that is today to be able to say I was wrong. I was wrong. And that's part of my journey. I think most people's politics have changed. You know whose politics have changed the most and they won't admit it? Are my Republican friends, right? The party that
Yeah.
used to be for fiscal responsibility and less government now wants our governor in your classroom, in your doctor's office, in your bedroom, and they're blowing up deficits and debt in Washington, D.C. We've all changed. Maybe the difference between me and my former Republicans is I admit it. I admit it. And I think I changed more towards justice and more towards democracy and to empowering all people, where my former colleagues chose a different direction.
That's awesome. Thank you for sharing that. And I think that real quick before I let you get to your question, Christian, I know that, I think you count as a Gen Xer or like a boomer cusp.
I'm
That's a very
52. I don't
important.
know. You got
Yeah.
to tell me. I don't know.
I'm pretty sure that's Gen X because that's like,
Makes sense.
I think to me those things matter because, it that just shows there is, it's you can people just think like as you get older that you grow one way or the other like
Yeah.
the trope used to be you become more conservative as you get older, but so I like to see people that are different and grow a different way.
You know what I think has changed, though? This is very important. I think the attack on individual autonomy and on personal liberties, it's not that we haven't seen it in past eras, but we're in a decade where it's real. It's real. We have a 6-year-old and 4-year-old. I don't know who they're going to choose to love or to worship, but I know based on where life takes them, their future looks very different in the state of Florida. The culture wars have victims. I don't know which side of that culture war my children will end up on. And so I feel a calling to try to protect all kids and all youth and frankly all adults right now from from the culture wars. And look, I mentioned my faith. I'm not intimidated by diversity of love and life and worship. I actually think it's our strength. I want my kids to be exposed to the greatest amount of diversity of love, life, academia, culture, whatever that might be, because it makes them stronger, more capable people, more empathetic to their neighbors, more able to make their own life decisions as they grow and to be able to choose their paths. I'm not intimidated by that. And I say that as a person of Christian faith. I want it.
Mhm.
I want it because for the faith community, it should make your faith stronger, whatever that faith is for you, right? The basics. I'm not defending Christianity over other faiths. And frankly, the affinity I have with my agnostic and atheist friends who very often are more charitable than people of faith, but the basic values that should hold us together, I want my kids exposed to that. And so, yes, maybe as you age, the trend line has been to become more conservative, but we are in an era where people's basic fundamental protections are under attack. And maybe with age comes a little wisdom, and we need more people who are aging to recognize that and become defenders of freedom and liberty in this moment.
Awesome. Yeah.
Absolutely. But
Sorry,
let's stay on
Christian,
this
I cut
topic.
you off.
No, you're good. You're good because I want to stay on this topic for a minute. There's several different words for it, and there's different terms for what this movement is. But I like to use the word reproductive freedom because it's all about freedom of body autonomy, right? We say reproductive rights, reproductive justice, reproductive whatever it is. It's reproductive freedom. It's women having the same control over their bodies that men have over their bodies, and that's what we're working towards. So you have described yourself as personally pro-life. You just said, it's in your faith and everything like that. Would you support a federal law to codify abortion rights without exceptions like 6-week bans?
Yeah, so I support the Roe Casey framework. It was good for 50 years and we should bring it back. I personally supported Amendment 4, and I don't think because it fell short in Florida of the 60% threshold for a constitutional amendment that means the governor shouldn't fight to enact it. Look, if more than 50% of the state supported reproductive freedom, supported recreational marijuana, supported open primaries, I know that's controversial within parties, I get it. But if we are going to say that we are going to fight for the majority of the states, then we need a governor or legislature that says, I don't care about the 60% threshold. If more than 50% of the state has said this is the will of the people, then we need to fight for it. Now, look, I actually also wrestle with this notion. It is almost too easy. It's reflexive to say, because too many politicians do this. I'm personally pro-life, but I'm for reproductive freedom. I actually think that this gets into esoteric areas we don't need to get to, but too often we get put into camps based on labels. And then the parties pick them up and subscribe these litmus tests. And the reality of the pro-life, pro-choice crowds is both of those values are values that we should embrace. Most people support life, right? Everybody supports life. Everybody supports choice, supports freedom. That's the power of the two movements. And what Roe and Casey got right is they actually wrestled with this very hard question. And where I think I'm afraid the advocacy camps, and it's understandable, reached for absolutism in this space. What Roe and Casey represent is the state's balancing test, the nation's balancing test to say we start with fundamental freedoms, bodily autonomy, reproductive freedom. We protect that privacy for a woman and her doctor or her God or her family, whomever she chooses to seek counsel from or nobody at all. That fundamental freedom needs to be protected as the preeminent answer on the question of reproductive freedom. And then at some point, this is also the Roe Casey framework, the state has an interest in the viability of a fetus. And then that's where we bring in certain exceptions, right? That has always been the balancing test. And I think it's where most people are. And if we look at the two positions, it is also more where the Democrats are and where the advocates for reproductive freedom and the traditional pro-choice movement are as well. Very few voices in the pro-choice movement are advocating for what Donald Trump calls abortion on demand at 9 months. That's not part of the advocacy program. It is to recognize that when there are critical medical decisions, get the government out of them. That's a fundamental premise, right? But that balancing test of Roe and Casey, Roe v. Wade and Casey v. Planned Parenthood in 1998, it was good enough for 50 years, and it'd be good enough for the next 50 if we can legislate it and bring it back.
Thank you. Or-
For sure. Yeah. Um, mm, that's one of the things that you had said before that stuck with me is you were talking about everyone having a fair chance. And that's something like that's a word that's always been very important to me too. And one word, and what I've actually learned to substitute that with is equitable. More understanding that fair is like assuming that you are all starting at the same place, the same starting line, and equitable, is coming from the understanding that like some people have more access and resources and whatever, and so you have to like, build that gap up. And one of those gap areas that especially impact LGBTQ youth, trans youth especially, is homelessness and aging out of like foster care and whatnot, and then not, and you're essentially 18, like, here's $20 and have fun figuring it out. So a lot of those gap services have been taken away in the last, 10, 15 years, 15, 20 years here in Florida. Is that something that you would advocate to come back in to like refund and help, help the youth in
Yeah.
that way?
Look, budgets reflect priorities. And we know that the culture wars under Ron DeSantis and Republicans in Tallahassee have had victims, real victims. And part of that victimization has been to defund programs for certain communities. Right? I mean, I do think that the reality of white Christian nationalism is a reality we need to recognize and call out for its fail points, starting first that Jesus wasn't white. He was a Middle East
Okay.
refugee. But and so we have co-opted in the United States in the last, you could make the case from the beginning of our country, but it raises its head, right? In the last 10 years, we've suggested that white Christian nationalism is rooted in some puritanism, and that requires us to then push away and marginalize and attack certain communities that have already been marginalized throughout history. We see it among communities of color. We see it in our immigrant communities. We see it among the LGBTQ plus community. And then when you move to an emerging era around trans and trans youth, and look, I think it's important to recognize that some of these emerging eras in history have some fits and starts, right? Where society has its learning curve, its growth curve, its acceptance curve, where legislation ultimately has to arrive to protect civil rights and civil liberties and fundamental protections. But we're now a decade or so into this national conversation. And I think, look, the impactful thing for me when it came to the trans community, I once spoke to someone close to Joe Biden who said, look, Joe Biden would be the first person to tell you he doesn't fully understand the life of a trans individual because of his age, his walk of life, whatever. It was an admission, a vulnerability. He said, but he'd be the first person to say that everybody deserves protection and that we're going to stand up to the person that is being denied rights and equities, and certainly stand up to the person who's being bullied. Um, my life has not been touched personally with a member of the family who is trans. It has with the LGBT community, but I was touched by a grandfather who called me about 3 years ago, and I hadn't spoken to this man in 20 years. And he called me and he said, "Look, I'm calling everybody I know with a voice." At this point, I was on TV regularly, and he said, "I want to tell you the story about my grandchild, who, as a trans youth, went through the suicidal ideations, went through the challenges of leaving home or not, and as a family." We embraced it. We sought the right pathways, the medical pathways, the gender affirming care for this grandchild. And this was when Tallahassee was wrestling with this really, draconian legislation during a special election called about, or a special session called about insurance, I think, led them to this other issue. Um, and he said, look, if this legislation passes, the doctor will be arrested for continuing to care for my grandchild. The parents could lose their child could be removed from their home. And the story about this child is they're now on the cusp of being the valedictorian in their class, surrounded by friends with
Right.
feelings of confidence in their personal identity and who they are and have always been. And if this legislation passes, I don't know what that means for the future of this child. I was, I'm a do-it-yourselfer. I was on top of our pool screen cage, rescreening our pool, having this call, thinking, "Am I going to fall off the screen?" Because it was that empowering from my understanding of what it meant in this moment. I went on TV an hour later. I shared this grandfather's story, and it's interesting as I do town halls. I can start to see, as I say, who has had that conversation. It's someone who may not have that family member who is trans, may not have been personally touched by the discrimination and the marginalization of a trans individual, but has learned what it really, really means, right? That culture wars have victims. It makes you an advocate. And, at a time when too many people, I think, are looking at the Democratic Party saying we have to pivot. No, we have to recommit to our values. Right? When I mentioned the economy should work, the government should serve, but most importantly, everybody should be protected and empowered and lifted up. That includes everyone. We need to amplify that value into communities, frankly, faith communities, and say the notion of caring for everyone, of lifting everyone up, of ensuring everyone has the same opportunities is a faith teaching if you're a member of the faith community. But if you simply believe in what Jefferson called the natural rights of man, we should all be working towards that end. And it is hard not to see what is happening in our national politics as anything other than an attack on a marginalized community. And look, that's where my politics are. You get me going on some of these topics. I'm not afraid to defend equity. We need more politicians
Awesome.
willing to do it in this moment.
For sure. Yeah.
Absolutely. Let's stay on this topic for a minute. I want to do a little bit of a call out, but it's a soft call out, just to get your perspective on it. Back in 2014, you voted on an amendment that allowed discrimination against LGBTQ plus federal contractors. And today, of course, you said that you say you support equality and equity and everything like that. What changed, and why should LGBTQ plus Floridians trust you now?
Yeah, no, thank you. I don't recall that exact vote. And so this is not a pivot. This is truly to say when you take thousands of votes, it's not hard to frame a candidate's or an incumbent's votes or positions however you want to. The game is kind of set up that way, to be honest. And I would also say there are a lot of votes that have fail points, right? After the Pulse nightclub, I led the effort to try to solve that particular issue around gun violence. The notion that someone who's not allowed to fly on a plane could buy a gun and it doesn't get caught in the background check. The Democrats' bill didn't include due process. Republicans said, we're not going to go along with it because there's no due process. And honestly, the two sides were fine to play to a tie on that. I hold both parties accountable for not having solved that issue because I introduced a bill that was the Democratic language but included due process. And the Democratic leader said, we're not going to work with you, Jolly, because we're trying to beat you in the next election. And I said, well, then take my name off of it. I will still deliver the 10 votes you need, make it a Democratic bill, but let's actually solve this issue that resulted in 50 people getting killed at Pulse. And they said no. So I say that the Planned Parenthood example being a perfect one, right? My critics would say my bill that said we're going to move the money from Planned Parenthood to community health centers. I've already heard it this race, right? Jolly wrote the bill to defund Planned Parenthood. That's accurate. The framing is completely wrong. The context is completely wrong. I say that not to disagree with you, Christian. I imagine the reason that vote can be pulled and looks like that is for some issue that is separate from defending equality. I think it probably is on a separate constitutional or legal question that I would have taken that vote. I think the way I would answer that with an assurance is as a Republican in the 2014 Congress who supported marriage equality, there were only three of us. It was Ross Layton and myself and Fred Upton from Michigan. I was a leader among Republicans fighting for the LGBTQ plus community. We could pull different votes that would challenge that in a singular narrative, but I assure you in the broad narrative, I have always been an ally. I actually was a recipient of a recognition from, I don't know that it was Human Rights Watch, but one of the strong advocacy groups. I was their kind of annual recipient of a recognition for leadership and courage because at the time that was seemingly a courageous position for a Republican. I never quite understood why it required courage, but I don't dispute that vote I took, but I do imagine there was a reason other than protecting equality.
Yeah, absolutely. And the reason I asked that is because I wanted to get something like that answer that you gave me. Politics is not always clear 100%. It's not always crystal clear what you're voting on and things like that. So a lot of people have taken that point of view where it's like they see the one bad vote that you might have taken for whatever specific reason. But you just gave a lot of your background where you have been championing LGBTQ rights.
Yeah,
So
and Nathan, let me jump in here because look, I'm a candidate. We may or may not have a primary. It's not my place to say whether we should have a primary. I do think we need to unify, and whether that is among multiple candidates or only one, we can't build each other up by tearing someone else down. And I say that because I know there is a pathway for a Democratic nominee to win the governorship. This is a cycle unlike any past cycles. Throw out all the conventional wisdom. This is not 22. This is not 24. This is 26. People are screaming for change, screaming for change. And so I know a Democrat can win, but we hurt ourselves if we end up in a circular firing squad and tear each other down. The reason I talk about the values is I think that brings us all together. If we nitpick around each other, not suggesting you all are doing this is a broader conversation for our party right now. It will be easy for critics of mine to say Jolly's not a good enough Democrat. I would challenge that. Actually, to be honest, I used to say to my friends on MSNBC, I feel like more of a Democrat than you do some days, you know. But I would say maybe the question shouldn't be who's the good enough Democrat, but who's proven to be a strong enough Democrat. And here's what I mean by that. I have fought Republicans more than many Democrats have been willing to do. As a Republican who challenged my party every step of the way because I thought they were going adrift. And then when Donald Trump emerged, I actually took on Donald Trump. I was the only Republican member of Congress in that 16 cycle who called on him to drop out of the race, did it from the House floor, never came around, never supported him, spent 10 years on TV saying we're going in the wrong direction. I don't buy the litmus test around who's a good enough Democrat. I think the fairer question is who has proven the ability to fight Republicans. And I use that in the general term of fight at the ballot box, right? But this ultimately is a contest of ideas with Republicans, not with each other. And if I have an opportunity to emerge into leadership of this party as the nominee, what I want us to focus in on is this is not a fight against each other. This is a contrast of our vision with the person that Republicans will put up. And on that contrast, we will win every time. If we fight each other, we're going to lose every time. And it's one of the real concerns I have right now.
Okay. And that's true. And so let's talk about some of the things that, are definitely for sure within the purview of the governorship that our current governor has done that maybe you'd want to reverse. Like, can we get some fluoride back in the water, perhaps?
You know what I want to do? What I love about being a Democrat is we accept science and math and data and public health and vaccines. I actually get excited thinking about bringing back subject matter experts into places of leadership. On day one, we fire the Surgeon General. We replace somebody who understands public health. We bring into our water district boards and our public service commission that regulates utilities, people who believe in clean air and clean water and climate science. We actually adopt climate science as a fact in the state of Florida. We fire as many of the state university system officials that DeSantis has put into place that we can. We bring back somebody who understands academics and diversity and excellence in education and growing institutions. There is so much that needs to be done. And it also reflects, though, my view of leadership in politics, business, and life. The best leaders lead shoulder to shoulder, surround themselves with people who know more sometimes, oftentimes, than the governor or the principal knows, right? No governor has all the answers. Our current governor thinks he does. I don't. I have a vision of where we need to go based on our values. I have a fairly good policy understanding after 30 years in politics. I'm a bit of a wonk. There are places I want to go to attack the affordability crisis, to redo our energy and utility structure that brings in clean air and clean water, that gives first-time property tax relief for first-time home buyers, that invests for 10 years in public education, that dramatically reforms our current choice program when it comes to education. I know where we want to go. No single candidate does that. We do that by being brave enough and courageous enough to bring in people who are smarter than I am. to say, I want the brightest minds across the state of Florida who believe in science and data and math and public health to lead our state institutions. And my job is to help build that coalition. As the candidate and the governor, I'm just one small cog in that wheel. I actually get excited. I know this is kind of wonky and geeky. I get excited about bringing back subject matter expertise into places where we need it.
No, that's perfect. I mean, as the nerd that is looking, moved to Florida looking to get hired by government to be employ my nerdy experience, like I love to hear that. So again, I guess the other little other question, no sticky fingers in Medicaid either, right? We're good on that. None of that'll be involved.
We should expand Medicaid. We're one of only 10 states that
Thank
hasn't
you.
expanded Medicaid. I also think in this environment where Medicaid is being drawn back, we may need to move to a place of discretionary budget grants for what are emerging as rural health deserts across the state of Florida. Look, Medicaid, I can tell you what's going on. It is a generational misunderstanding of Medicaid now, in addition to just an ideological attack on healthcare. Depending on your age, Medicaid meant something different, right? When I was growing up in rural Pasco County, Medicaid was basically the provider at the public health clinic, and it was the single place in the county where families without means went. What emerged as honestly our policymakers just screwed up healthcare writ large, and as healthcare got away with too much and became too expensive, Medicaid grew into a provider or a coverage for more and more families. Medicaid covers 40% of childbirth care and postpartum care, of early childhood care. Medicaid provides for virtually, I won't say all, but the largest amount of our essentially end of life care, right? Skilled nursing facilities, residential skilled nursing facilities, residential care and memory centers. And Medicaid provides for that family of 4 with 2 children who can't afford healthcare. Medicaid also provides for our families with individuals on the with IDD, the intellectual and developmental disabilities. Under Jeb Bush, he got the wait list for services through what is the Medicaid waiver program, give or take, for the last 20 years. He got the wait list for services to 0 because he made a commitment. Jeb Bush made a commitment to this community, one of the most overlooked communities in the country, that we're going to ensure services are provided. That wait list now is over 15 years for many people, over 20 years. The way you come off that wait list is to present a crisis. So the 52-year-old man with Downs, who is now suffering from Alzheimer's because it disproportionately impacts the Downs community, who needs services. And by the way, the aging parent will likely leave the earth before that adult child does. What are we doing as a state to provide for that individual? That safety net is eroding. So look, there's a whole basket of goods when it comes to healthcare and services for those in need of healthcare and healthcare adjacent services. Florida has decided not to do it. And I just think that's wrong, right? That's a contrast of values with the other side of the aisle.
Absolutely. Let's talk real quick about the authoritarian style leadership we currently have, because it's not only across the country, it's also directly here in our state. And it seems like Florida is the first stop on this authoritarian train, because it started here in Florida, and it's happening in Texas, and it's you know things like that. So what's your message to people who are afraid of where the country's going and where the state of Florida is going, and how do you feel like you can change and reverse that with a super
Direct
majority that we have?
democracy. Yeah, democracy has come under attack. The rule of law has come under attack. I mean, we look to Washington a lot. I want to point out this entire time, I haven't spoken about the president once, because this race is about Florida and the governorship. It's not about the White House and the presidency. There will be other races to litigate that. But unfortunately, to your point, Christian, in Florida, we replicate and at times we're the test bed for some of these challenges, right? Our governor wants to be the governor that eliminates any race-based considerations for how district lines are drawn. He wants race-neutral lines because that allows us to actually further quiet communities of color. He wants fully to be able to politically draw lines. Understand the contrast here, right? The elimination of race-based lines sounds, okay, maybe I buy into that, we're a meritocracy and so forth. But it does not work when what you're actually proposing is completely politically gerrymandered lines, because you're using that to quiet the voices of communities of color. That's an attack. Gerrymandering is an attack. The reduction in access points for voting is an attack on democracy for people, because he knows fewer people will be able to exercise their franchise and their suffrage. The the restrictions on amending the Constitution are an attack on that democracy. We talk about the rule of law under attack in Washington. Guess what happened when the governor and first lady, using the terms of a Republican legislative committee, apparently broke the law by stealing $10 million from the Medicaid program? That goes away because he appointed his chief of staff as attorney general, and nobody's going to investigate those charges at the state level or the federal level, because the rule of law only applies to Democrats in this administration. The attack on home rule, right? So in Key West, voters voted to keep the large cruise ships out to protect the environment and density concern.
Mhm.
Voters voted for that in Key West, and DeSantis and Republicans said, we're not going to let you do that. You know why? Because DeSantis turned around and took $1 million check from the cruise lines. In Sarasota, they voted for open primaries, I think, or ranked choice voting, one of the Democrat electoral reform measures, just for their municipal elections. DeSantis and Republicans overruled it. An attack on home rule, direct democracy. If it's in St. Pete because it's plastic bags, or if it's in Polk County where people are fighting for rent control, this governor will overrule the will of the people if it is a blue community and he disagrees
Mhm.
with their local priorities, but he'll let it go wild in the red communities. That's all an attack. And so I say all that because the answers then present themselves pretty easily. We have to undo and unpack all of that he's been doing. I actually think we need independent redistricting commissions. Now, I would say right now, blue states should fight fire with fire. Democracy's under attack. Respond as Gavin Newsom did. But the end goal for us should be independent redistricting commissions or an improvement of fair districts. We should expand voting access. Voting should be as easy and accessible as it can be secure, and it is secure. Right now, we trade billions or trillions of dollars on cell phones every day without fail points. There are a lot of ways we could expand the vote. We should go back to local control. If a local community wants something, let them do it if that's how they choose. I met with a group of Democratic Socialists in St. Pete recently, not all of them, but a fair contingency within the group. And they were asking about whether or not I would support rent control as governor. And I said, look, as governor, I don't think that's a state policy. And I said, I would not do that, right? I was honest. I would not do that. And I said, but in local communities, in the city of St. Pete or Lakeland or somewhere else, if voters determine to apply rent control to certain places, if that's a local decision, Ron DeSantis would attack home rule and say, no, my job is what I used to think the Republican Party believed in. Decisions closest to the people are the right ones and the most important. The governor should stay out of those places. Look, local control, democracy, that people's franchise and suffrage has been under attack for a long time. We've got a lot to undo, and I would commit to doing it.
Absolutely. And especially when you talk about gerrymandering and redistricting, Pinellas seems to be a hotbed every 10 years, or a contested area every 10 years, because St. Pete is very liberal, but the rest of Pinellas County is very, I would say very purple, very independent.
Purpley.
Not
Yeah.
fully red, but very purple.
Yeah.
And we've seen it after the 2020 census, where they took St. Pete out of Pinellas County, just specifically St. Pete, and put it over with Hillsborough, and left the rest of Pinellas County to be its own district. So when it comes to redistricting specifically, we do have a major problem of that right here in Pinellas County that we need to address.
That's a part of the story of my political career. I got redistricted, I think, 3 times in 3 years when I was in Congress, right? I got elected. It was a 50-50 district. President Obama won it twice, and I won it twice. And I think more districts should be like that. But then
Mhm.
fair districts passes, and it dramatically changed the congressional district I was in. We picked up about 100,000 voters of color in South St. Pete, and I became the most vulnerable member of Congress, right? And now I didn't walk away from it. I spent time in the community, and where I think Rick Scott got maybe 4% in those precincts. As a Republican, I got 15 or 16 points in those precincts because I led with my values to try to build a coalition. But that was the election cycle then that Charlie Crist came in, because it was the most unwinnable seat for a Republican in that year. And and what happened though is Charlie served for 6 years, and then that district changed again, and the gerrymanderers got away with removing that part of South Pinellas, kicking it back over to Tampa, and then we ended up with Luna. And it's interesting. Look, I mean, this is my personal journey. It's a little more personal to me than others. It is funny to see the armchair quarterbacking among politicians about how the Pinellas seat has switched between politicians. It hasn't switched between politicians, its lines have shifted. And as the lines shift, you create opportunities. And what Republicans have figured out is rather than change our unpopular positions, we're just going to change the lines. And that's how we're going to protect our majority. The end of the day, as I mentioned, fight fire with fire for the blue states. But we've got to get to a point of independent redistricting, more electoral reforms that ultimately give voice to people. And I would say to to Democrats writ large, myself included, we shouldn't be afraid to embrace the independent voter. Look, when I was trying to organize the independent space, James Carville used to say, Jolly, you're just taking votes from Democrats. And I would say, James, these votes are available to Democrats. I spent 6 years as an independent in Pinellas County. And I'm a super voter, right? The way we categorize, like I never missed an election. And I never once received outreach from either major party.
Mhm.
They overlook the independent vote. If you're not one of us, we don't care. That's an opportunity for us as Democrats. The reason I talk about our values is I think it unites Democrats, but it's bigger than our party. I spoke to about 200 Republicans in Sarasota today. Not all Republicans, but a heavily Republican crowd. And I could tell in that audience, I spoke about values that are incontrovertible. You tell
Mhm.
me why the economy shouldn't work for everybody. You tell me why government shouldn't provide excellence in public education or respond to storm victims. You tell me why everybody shouldn't be welcome. Those values are Democratic values. It's why I found my home in the Democratic Party. But boy, we should be shouting those values to communities bigger than our party. And if we don't, we lose. We lose. Math is math. There are not enough Democratic voters in the state of Florida to elect a Democratic governor. But if we can take our Democratic values to a broader audience, we win. And we shouldn't be afraid to do that.
Absolutely.
One last question for you before we get into our final segment of our shutdown or shout out series. Is okay. So things governor can control if elected. Removing barriers to allowing the reenfranchisement of prior incarcerated voters.
Sure. That's right.
Okay,
Absolutely. Look,
perfect.
voters wanted it. Republicans made sure it wasn't going to happen when they passed the implementing legislation. What Republicans did was wrong.
Perfect. Okay. And then also helping to do what we can to maybe move forward getting ranked choice voting in the state.
I I support the whole basket of goods of electoral
Gotcha.
reform. One of the things Alaska did was they went to open primaries, which is really just allowing all voters to meet on the same day that all candidates appear. And then they used ranked choice voting. Well, and then their open primary system produced the top four. The top four go to November, and then they used ranked choice voting. This is where, look, my Republican predecessor, Bill Young, um, was a true legislator. Now, listen, he came of age in the 60s, right? His record on a lot of issues today is far out of touch. But he was someone who was considered a moderate and a legislator and so forth. And he's the one that taught me when Republicans in Tallahassee were trying to gerrymander away South St. Pete, he would say, we need to be able to win South St. Pete. We shouldn't be afraid of South St. Pete. We should be able to win South St. Pete. Let's figure out as a party where the disconnect is. And so I just embrace that ethos as well. I understand the arguments against some of these electoral reforms, ranked choice voting, open primaries. I know a lot of Democrats and Republicans have strong feelings about it, right? It's our party. You should be a part of our party to determine our destination. That's a very convincing argument. But somewhere in here, doubling down on a minority of Florida voters while ignoring the group that could make us a majority, it just doesn't make math sense. And I would argue there's a little bit of a moral wrong in there as well. Like,
Yep.
we should be a party. Here's the difference between me and Byron Donalds. Byron Donalds wants to get elected governor so he can represent the people who vote for him. I want to get elected governor so I can represent everybody. Now, I think if we start with culture wars, that means everybody that has been left behind and marginalized over the last 8 years. But we should be a Democratic Party, doesn't dilute our values, but say, we are going to bring everybody along. Because when we win on those values, we give reason for the independent and Republican voter to reconsider whether or not they want to be a part of the Democratic Party. I'm afraid if we just focus on voter registration, we need more Democratic registered voters. We're not going to switch voter registrations if we don't change hearts and minds. We got to change hearts and minds, and then the voter registrations will come. Part of the way we do that is we reach out to that independent Republican voter and say, we want you to be a part of this coalition.
Awesome. Thanks.
Absolutely. So I think that's all the questions we had for right now. It's been a great conversation so far. I know that we could come up with a million more questions and keep you here for several more hours, but we won't do that to you. Instead, we want to invite you back later on down the road.
Let's
So
do it.
we'll work with you. We'll work with your team. We want to have you back for sure. But before we
Let's
let
do
you
it.
go, we do have a segment called Shout Out or Shut Down, which is where all three of us can shout out something positive or shut down something negative that's happening in St. Pete, Pinellas County, Florida, or across the United States or world, wherever you want to go. So I have a shutdown. Laura, what do you have?
I've got a shout out.
You've got a shout out. David, do you have a shutdown or shout out?
I got both. It's two sides of the same coin, but I'll go last.
Okay, that sounds perfect.
All right, so we'll
Do you
start
want to
on a
go?
positive note.
Yeah, I'll start.
Yep.
I'll start and then we'll do Christian and then we'll end up with David. Okay, so my shout out is to this is gonna be really weird, but it's fine. I'm shouting out the little tiny city of Thornville, Ohio, which is where I was at my camping EDM festival this past week it's called Lost Lands. I don't even know. I think there was at least 20,000 people there, if there were not more, between camping and people flying in and staying in hotels in Columbus, and we are just a bunch of weirdos that go to these EDM festivals. So they tolerate us, they love us, they give us, they help with make our food and give us lots of ice and water. And I just want to appreciate the town of Thornville, Ohio, for letting the Wooks take over for a week. Thank you so much.
All right. Perfect. Well, I do have a shutdown, like I said, and it's really important, I think, and it's going to be a call to action to our viewers and listeners. I got to shut down the attack that we're seeing on our First Amendment rights, freedom of speech, and what our Attorney General is now calling the difference between freedom of speech and hate speech. There's no difference. It's the same thing. Hate speech is protected under free speech. We get haters all the time. We get people that come in and don't like us and say whatever they want. I am guilty of saying things about people that I don't like. It's free speech for a reason. So when we see a president and an attorney general challenging that and saying that hate speech they're going to go after for anybody, and then you see these large corporations like ABC and Disney turn around and cancel shows, just like they did with Stephen Colbert, and then what they did with Jimmy Kimmel, where they suspended him, and they're attacking the media first and foremost. So I want to shut down that because we need to pay attention with what they're doing on the free speech side of things and why they're doing it, because they're trying to control the narrative. They're trying to have a um, state-run media. So we need to pay attention to that.
Very good.
Yep. Yep.
So Christian, I'm going to pick up where you left off because that's exactly where I was going. I think the
Awesome.
shutdown is, we all agree, everyone agrees, we should shut down violence, political violence, and we've got to shut down hate as well. We should shut down hate. We should condemn hate, hateful words, while protected. We don't need hateful words in our politics. It's not helpful. And I think the lessons of the last 2 weeks have shown us that we need to do better shutting down violence, but we also need to call out speech that is hateful when it is hateful. It's protected.
Yeah.
But the shout out then, as part of doing that, is to free speech itself. Free speech is protected. And even if people want to call it hate speech, you're right. Charlie Kirk's speech was protected. And the greatest way that his allies and supporters and my friends on the right could honor his legacy is to recognize the protections that are due right now to those with voices of concerns and criticism, voices of dissent. If you support and accept the narrative that has been displayed on behalf of Mr. Kirk, then the right way to honor his legacy is to celebrate and invite into the public arena the voices of dissent and the voices who express concern about his legacy and his words. That's the embrace. And to be honest, it has been interesting to see the coalition of people that get that. Joe Rogan, Ted Cruz, Jimmy Kimmel. Democrats and Republicans alike understand everything we just talked about. We should all condemn speech. We should condemn hate. But we should also recognize that all speech is protected, and even speech that some consider hateful has to be protected. But certainly voices of dissent, voices that challenge the regime, voices that challenge government, most importantly have to be protected, because that is the foundation of who we are as a society. When we lose that, we lose a lot more than just a political battle that I'm afraid my friends on the right think that this has become.
Precisely.
Absolutely. Thank you for taking that and running with it, because you said everything that I wanted to say just much more clearly. So thank you for that. Thank you again for joining us. This has been great. Again, we want to have you back later on down the line. So we're going to work with you. We're going to get in touch. We'd love to have you back.
Great.
And our viewers, I'm sure, would love to hear from you again. So thank you again for being here.
Hey, wonderful to be with you. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, David, for joining us. And I'm just like stalling for a second here to look at my calendar, because if people enjoyed this conversation with David and you want to hear more from him, you could join us at the Stonewall Pinellas monthly meeting on Thursday, October 16th, where I believe he'll be joining us then as well. So if you want to hear more and you want to ask David some of your own questions, feel free to mark that down on your calendar. Alrighty, well, and so that's all we've got for tonight. Please remember, listeners, to like us and follow us on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube. We're at For St. Pete's Sake. Subscribe to our podcast wherever you catch new podcasts. And if you could leave us a rate and review, that helps us promote on the algorithm as well. We'll be back next week with more stories from the people doing the hard work to make our community better. Until next time, for St. Pete's sake, keep pushing for change.